So in the theme of the great debate over agents or structures, you can see I've taken the road of the squirrel on the top corner there, which is to firmly sit on the fence and look more at and ask the question is looking at the interrelationship between the idea of agents and structures. And I think that there's a really fruitful conversation to be had about that. So next slide. So I guess the question becomes, what methods can we use to sort of empirically explore this question of and support the theory building of the relationship between structures and agents? And what I would propose to you is that a really interesting method or tool, perhaps, is to integrate more social network analysis into the work. And really to emphasize that it's a part of an iterative process that needs to be complemented with other methods. But what I want to do here is sort of touch on that briefly. Then I'm going to talk about the contributions that I have seen, the potential that it offers, by looking at a place far from the south, which is the Arctic, and look at how this exposes issues around structure and issues around scales of agency. And then look at what the opportunities are for policy diffusion and transfer specifically. So next slide. So this is the super quick 101 of social network analysis. Social network analysis sort of identifies this idea of nodes that are connected by ties, so that being the relationship between two nodes. Now, a node can be an individual, it can be an organization, it can be a country, it can be a concept, and so you can really, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of this. But if you start to map the connections between different types of nodes, you can get a sense of the relationship between them and get a better understanding of what the significance of the relationship is. So for example, on the left-hand side, you have sort of an example of an extremely centralized node on the far left, all the way through to a very decentralized network on the far right. And the idea being that it depends on the one on the far left really depends very much on one particular node, that there's no information flowing or action flowing between those things unless that one node is connecting the other nodes. Whereas what you see in the far right, on the other side of the spectrum, is all the nodes are connected, therefore no node is particularly important in terms of the flow of information, and so the impact that the power of a particular node is reduced in that kind of setting. So, and then on the other side, to sort of expand that out, in a network where you see, in a sort of a more complex network environment, an open network is one like you see in the second visual here, which again has a central node and lots of little pieces, and so you get the sense that there's not really a lot of connection. And a closed network would be one where all of the nodes are connected and they're interconnected, and so you can see that sort of dynamic environment. So next slide, please. So, exposing structures. There's been a lot of conversation over the last little while about how you do that, and obviously there's different types of structures. What this isn't a normative exercise. This doesn't talk about networks as good or bad. It really just tries to illustrate the relationship between particular actors, and it does it in a really interesting way. So the example on the far left is about a policy advisory system that basically looks at climate change and climate change policy in the Arctic. And this is during a period when the Arctic was of very little interest, and so very quickly what this visual will show you is during that period, the states that were within the Arctic were very much at the center of that network, and there was really, everybody else was only feeding in through them. So there was a real control of the network around climate policy in the Arctic, or in the states specifically in the Arctic. But what's interesting is, and I mean this comes a bit to the question of path dependence, with a transition to a world where the Arctic becomes a new frontier of policy and a place that the international community is more interested in, you can get a sense of the temporality of a network and that there can be shifts and changes, that structures are dynamic, they're not static. And so in the period between 2005 and 2015, this is the same network, but with you can see this sort of expansion and the interconnections. You have more actors, there's more of a connections between the actors, and so you fundamentally get a sense that structures do evolve and they do shift. And I think that that's, we have to treat these structures as evolving in nature, and the implications of that for policy transfer, that what you see in point A and what you see in point C, there's a significance to whether or not you understand the dynamics of structures and how they evolve. So that's the first sort of key thing that I think that this methodology offers. The second one, if you can change the slide, is the question of scale of agency. So here's a terrifying, this is a network analysis of all the experts involved in climate policy in the North between the periods of 1998 and 2015. Now you look at that and you go, what the heck does that actually tell you, right? Like, wow. But what's interesting about this is, and what it really highlights, is this question of this map. As a researcher who'd collected data, my first step was to take a look at the relationship between individuals, because agents are individuals, so let's see who the prominent individuals are. And I could tell you a story about that. But what's more important is through an iterative process of using this methodology along with sort of interviews and an observation, I began to understand that I wasn't really capturing the dynamics by just looking at the relationships between particular actors. And so what's important is, in the next slide, what's important is that you need to know how to shape how to define the data in a way that exposes the network in a more meaningful way. And so what you need to understand is, in this particular policy environment, all of the information from a particular country is fed through the government of that country. And so if you redefine it by the country, here you have, this is the network of experts in Canada specifically working on this topic. And what comes out of this is you have 298 experts, 45 different organizations, and it's a very dense network. But what's most interesting about it is it's mostly government agencies. And so it's a centralized network run by governments. So the expertise exists within governments, and so you then begin to understand a very different type of dynamic that exists in this particular network that is sort of driven by the capacity within governments themselves, which is contrasted by, if you want to switch to the next one, the network in the United States. And what's interesting about the network in the United States is this is a much more decentralized and open network, but there's a reason for it, and that is the government no longer, in this context, the US government doesn't have internal capacity to provide expertise on this particular policy area. Instead, they fund external experts, so universities, think tanks, consultants. And so this is what you see in this environment is that the government, you have to understand that this network depends on a funding regime. And so as soon as that funding regime falls apart, i.e. in a Trump administration where you don't want science policy, it's at risk that this entire network could fall apart. And what are the implications for that for policy and how it exposes the relationship between the structure? But you have to get the level of agency correct. You can't assume that by looking at the individual you're going to best understand the structure. You have to understand the functionings of the policy community in order to best focus on where the agency lies. Next slide. And so ultimately, I mean, I come back to re-emphasizing that social network analysis becomes a complementary method and really part of an iterative process. I'm working with Les Powell right now, and we've been collecting a lot of data, and we're generating social network analysis maps, but at the end of the day, it's very difficult to determine. You can look at it, but you don't, all it does is generate questions. You can't provide answers by looking at that map, but what you can then do is ask yourself the question and then explore those particular research questions. But then you can come back to your data again and re-slice it in a way that it may actually have a more meaningful impact just at a quantitative level in relationship to the qualitative data that you collect. So I think that this becomes a really powerful way of looking empirically at specific relationships. So as I've done with the Arctic and Arctic policy context, I think that it really can be used as a method to expose the relationship between structure and agencies and consider questions like, in this particular structure, what does agency look like? And are there different structures that offer different opportunities for agency? And I also think it's a really interesting way to look at, to compare and contrast different specific cases. So you can look at it as a way to say, well, how is policy in the field of health, what does that policy field look like? What are the relationships? What are the structures involved? Compared to to something as like taxation. How might that be different? What might the structures look like, and what are the implications of that? And then ultimately, I think that you can look at this and you can sort of start to identify a relationship between particular sectors or particular policy fields and whether or not those networks look different. And ask yourself the question, does through this sort of theory building and through sort of building a richer empirical sort of comparative case to work with, can you look at typologies? Are there different types of structures, and what are the implications of that? Are there different types of relationships, and what are the implications of that? And does it speak to it, extrapolating that in a policy transfer context? Are there different types of influence based on that relationship between agency and structure? So, thank you. I had another question about which is a great question, which it's one of these things you sort of leave out. What is the tie? What is the relationship? How do you connect different actors when you're using social network analysis? And the great thing, from my perspective, is that you can use many different means to tie. So in the example that I provided you, they were experts that came together and provided policy advice. So what you're seeing there is co-authors to policy advice. But another example, which you would know, TT, she's the one who asked the question, is looking at Twitter and the relationship between different people exchanging information on Twitter and sharing information and being part of a community. But you can then use it by extension in the way that Leslie Powell and I are using it now, which is looking at those who participated in events. So in terms of defining what the node is and defining what the tie is, there's a lot of flexibility. And in terms of the comment about the value of exposing those and the limits of this as a means of looking at structure, I would completely agree that there are structures that are not visible. But I think there's often a relationship between those structures that are visible and those that aren't, and so they can be complementary. That it doesn't need to be about a discussion of only isolating yourself to looking at structures that are visible, but also looking at the relationship between those pieces that are visible from those that aren't. And I think that in and of itself is a useful exercise. So.